Hello and welcome everyone to Celebrating the Joy of Reading, part of the Big Jubilee Read. My name is Yvonne Bailey-Smith, and I'm delighted to be with you today, speaking to some special guests about their favorite recommendations from the Big Jubilee Read. The Big Jubilee Read is a reading for pleasure campaign celebrating great reads from across the Commonwealth to coincide with Her Majesty the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. An expert panel of librarians, booksellers, and literature specialists has chosen 70 titles from a Reader's Choice long list, with 10 books for each decade of Her Majesty's reign. The list offers brilliant, beautiful, and thrilling writing produced by authors from a wide range of Commonwealth countries over the last 70 years to engage all readers in the discovery and celebration of great books. The Big Jubilee Read is delivered by national charity, the Reading Agency, which tackles life's big challenges through the proven power of reading in partnership with BBC Arts. It received funding from Arts Council England, is supported by Libraries Connected and the Booksellers Association. Today's event is brought to you in partnership with Libraries Connected London, representing libraries across the capital. And this is the final of 6 events bringing together people from across the Commonwealth to discuss a range of themes and topics. You can catch up on any of the events on the Reading Agency's YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be speaking to some inspiring people about the Big Jubilee Read and the books that they have enjoyed and recommend. Later, I'll be joined by Booker Prize winner Damon Galgut and publisher Margaret Busby. But first, I'm speaking to Professor Susheila Nasta.
Hi.
Hello, Susheila. So just a brief introduction. It's lovely to meet you. Shayla Naster Mbe is founder of Wasafiri, the magazine of international contemporary writing. She launched in 1984 and led right up to 2019. Susheila is a literary activist, a writer, and presenter. She has judged several literary prizes, including the 2021 David Cohen Award, offered for a lifetime's work in any genre. She is currently Professor Emerita in Modern and Contemporary Literature at Queen Mary College. Susheila has published numerous books and articles since the 1980s, writing on Caribbean, South Asian, and Black British writing, with a focus especially on Sam Selvon's work, Black women's writing, as well as one of the first books in Britain on the literatures of the South Asian diaspora. She's currently completing a biography of the Bloomsbury Indians. She continues to act as literary representative for the estate of Sam Selvon. Again, thank you for joining us, Shayla.
Thank you.
I've got 3 questions for you. So the first is, could you tell us a little about a book on the list that you have enjoyed or that has meant a lot to you?
Well, you've already said it in a way, because one of the things I'm passionate about is the writing of Sam Selvon, who wrote many, many novels. But the book on the list that I'm particularly attracted to and have worked on for many years is The Lonely Londoners, which, as its title suggests, is about lonely Londoners. And it was published in 1956. It was particularly about, at that time, Black Londoners who came with the Windrush generation in the 1950s. But it's also about migration in general. And that's one reason why I'm particularly attracted to it, is that it's a book both about Black migration, but it's about any migrations. And it's such a relevant topic today as it was then. Its pain as well as its lure. And it can be read on so many levels. And even though I've read it several times, I keep going back to it, and it doesn't detract from its engagement for the reader, its humor, its pathos. And it shows us, I think, the importance of fiction in taking us inside the lives of others, even if we don't know their lives. Because when Sam wrote this book, of course, people didn't know what the lives of Black Londoners were like. They were looking at them as outsiders. So it creates a kind of empathy and ability to enter into other worlds. And in that book, he just creates a whole island in the city as these little islanders, if you like, come to a small island themselves.
Thank you for that. It's indeed a very beautiful book. I mean, I read it again for the second time. I read it when I was quite young. And recently, when I knew I would be doing this, hosting this event, I read it again. And it is just the way Sam walks us through London is just amazing. And I think so much obviously has come on the back of that book, you know, and you're so correct. You know, I think when we talk about the migrant story, people somehow, some people sort of immediately sort of seem to want to default to the African Caribbean, Indian experiences. But really, when you look around our world, you know, we are all, nearly all immigrants in one form or another. And the book really speaks, you're so correct, to people across all the divides. So thank you for that. That's lovely. So still, of course, on Sam, you are Sam's literary you're the executor of his estate, and you wrote the introduction to the Penguin Modern Classics edition of the book, the one I've just read. What was it, and you've touched on it, but what was it about this book that you were drawn to?
I think, as you were just saying, this idea of migration, of being in between, of trying to find a home in a new land, of the expectations of the migrant, any migrant that comes to a big urban city. After all, one has to remember the characters in this particular novel by Sam Selvon come from a whole group of different West Indian islands, as they were then called. They come from the Caribbean, but as he always said, they discovered their Caribbean identity in London because they didn't know each other. They didn't communicate with each other. They had a Jamaican didn't know who a Trinidadian was, or a Guyanese, or so on. I'm also attracted to the whole idea of this, his Black modernist vision so early on. And, you know, when it was first reviewed, it was described as a comedy of West Indian manners, a sort of sociological book telling the British what West Indians do in their spare time. But actually what it's about is the creation of a world which is kind of a dispossessed world post-World War II. You know, the white characters are equally as dispossessed as the Black ones. He talks about the white geezers fumbling their way through the streets. You know, they're in a ruined city. You know, it's a bit like Eliot's The Wasteland, and they're trying to find housing, jobs, love. And importantly, what really drew me to it when I first started to work on it was that it made me think very differently about how you write characters, how you write a city, how you write, what perspective you're writing from, how you tell a story in the voice of the characters who are being portrayed, who were largely illiterate figures, without in any sense reducing them as people. So he created a new way of reading and writing the city, which I think exploded some of these kind of stereotypes about Black working class characters. Absolutely. And how they've been defined previously. Absolutely.
Beautifully observant. And I just love the way, the kind of almost conversational way in which it is very conversational. It's like you're just following him around London, literally just, you know, seeing all of London just evolving, the people's stories evolving in front of your eyes. It's beautiful. And I was also thinking about that whole thing of identity and home, and what is home in the end when you're a migrant? Is it a place, or is it really something about the relationships that we live our lives in? And each of those characters arriving on the boat train, starting their lives with a relationship with the main character and the other people they meet, and are building a sense of home, sometimes in a place where mostly in a place, I suppose, that where there's a sense of familiarity. There are other Caribbean people that that's so interesting as well. You pointing out that the Caribbeans didn't actually know about each other, because we didn't. I was growing up in Jamaica in the early 60s, and I think the way we were educated, I mean, we were sort of given this very English kind of formal education, but really there was not much conversation about the rest of us. So the fact that there were an awful lot of us, and we were all over the world, and we were all over the Caribbean, and of course Africa was kind of left out of the equation altogether, unless it was being depicted in a very odd way, as we know. But yes, it's a magnificent book. So moving on to our last question. This event is in partnership with Libraries Connected, London. Again, the question overlaps, but you might have some more to say about it. Can you say a little more about the London presented in Sam's novel, and how he inspired? And how he inspired? Again, you've said a little about this. How did the London? How London inspired Sam Selvon?
I think the two are interrelated in a way, but I guess one of the things is that, and you've touched on this already, is that in terms of what you read in the Caribbean before you came to London, that applied to Sam too. Because of course he read all the Romantic poets, he'd read T.S. Eliot, he'd read all sorts of things, and he was reading popular fiction, German literature. People tend to think in terms of the language of this voice in the novel, which is written it was originally called dialect, now it's called nation language. It's written in a vernacular voice, a literary vernacular voice, which he has created and crafted. In order to create a city of words. He's trying to create a Black city of words, and the city is built by those words, and it's built by the orality and the banter of these characters who are called the boys. So they're kind of deliberately innocents abroad. They're not men, they're boys. They're all many of them. There's very few women. There's Nancy and there's very few women portrayed, which is a downside in some ways, but he always said that was the way he experienced London at the time when he arrived. But I think the kind of London he presents, as I touched on already, it's post-World War II. It's the arrival of the Windrush generation after the British government had invited them to come and put Britain back together after the war, and fulfill all the jobs that were lacking. Many men had died in the war. There were a lot of widows wandering around. And the London that he presents is actually both dream and nightmare. It's both a fantasy, an imagined world, the colonial dream, the motherland, where he imagines, that all his characters imagine the streets are paved with gold. But when they get there, it's a sort of jungle. It's like Dante's sort of Inferno. It's an underworld. And so talking about the reading, he's so subtle, you read it and there's this sort of orality, but, just at the opening of the novel, even, when he's on a number 46 bus going to Waterloo, which, like Ellis Island in the States, is a place of arrival and departure. He's creating this world, and it's like a Dickensian world. There's a fog over the city. It's bleak. But Moses knows every little bit of that route. He knows it like the A to Z. So he's a Londoner.
Absolutely.
But he's going to this place of arrival and departure, which is rather sad and poignant. So the London he's presenting in this novel is a place which is threatening to these small islanders who are arriving. And, you know, Andrea Levy, you know, who sort of follows on from Sam in a way, and is on this list as well,
Indeed.
has her novel called Small Island. And of course, it's the small islanders coming to the small island, but they don't think they're coming to the small island. They think they're coming to the big city. So what he's presenting there is a big city which is threatening. At the same time, he creates a big city which they make smaller by the group that they form in the city. So part of the telling of the ballads and the stories, you know, they puff themselves up like groups do at school, you know. Oh, do you know what I did the other day? Do you know who I met? Blah, 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 blah. It's all a lot of talk. But then underneath that, you have this kind of emptiness. And the what happening, which is a refrain throughout the book. So what happening these days, Moses? What happening? And Moses is the main character, or the semi-narrator. He becomes more the voice towards the end. And he's set against a much more buoyant and puffed up character who just arrives on the boat train.
So Galahad.
Yeah, Henry Oliver, who's christened Sir Galahad on arrival.
Yes.
And so all the boys are sort of quite small characters, but then they're inflated into becoming rather like calypsonian figures. They're inflated into becoming two-dimensional people. So like Bart, who's looking for his girl Beatrice, they all have a little tagline. Big city who carries the Times under his pocket, and so on. And yet, on the one hand, they're important characters. On the other hand, he deflates them all the time. There's, you know, how do they find an identity? How do they find a home? And they all live in basements. You know, they're all underground a lot of the time.
That's right. And that's something I didn't realize, actually. And so I started reading, what's the young lady, she wrote This Loveless City. That was published a couple of years ago, or a year ago. So is it Laura? Okay, I can never remember her name, always slips me, but that's an amazing book. And for some reason, I've done so much reading around the Windrush, but I wasn't really aware of that history where people were literally living underground. I thinking that is so beautifully put. And I'm thinking how Sam's book, I mean, we're now in 2022, but interestingly, I think this book still resonates. And, you know, so many books have been written. I mean, I think I was looking on the internet a while ago because I was doing an event on Andrea Levy's Small Island in Brighton Book Festival. And was amazed just how many books have tackled the same subject. And I'm curious, you know, because now we have the internet and globalization. It is interesting to me that in a way, people, and I go back to my own island, Jamaica, quite regularly, and I've been to the other Caribbean islands, but people still have this quite the strong idea still of England being this place, this country paved with gold. That is still there. And I don't know, it must be something about the kind of conversations that go on and not go on, because I think people go back and perhaps they don't always really talk about those bits, the real hardcore bits that Sam spoke about in The Lonely Londoners, because you're supposed to come here. The first wave of so-called Windrush migrants were supposed to come here, make their fortune, and go back to their islands and their countries within 5 years. Of course, that didn't happen. So I'm always intrigued about, and so writers keep writing. I mean, you know, every day. I mean, I think who's it now? Tony Fairweather's book, £28 and 10 shillings, have just come out, and he's looking at the perspective of the Windrush, the people on the boat, literally on the boat. But every year somebody writes another book about these experiences, which means that they're still incredibly relevant, even in 2022 Britain.
I think one of the things about Sam, though, that is particularly refreshing is that London becomes a character in itself. It becomes the city is a character, and that he democratizes language, and that he creates a new way of writing about the city. On the other hand, he is making political points, but like he was himself as a character, there's no way he would labor those points. So the book is it's not trying to you know, to hit you in the face with a point about Black migration. After all, it's called the lonely. It's not called the Black Londoners. It's called the Lonely
Londoners. Yes,
and that's quite deliberate on Sam's part. And it's not to say he didn't feel those political points, but he just felt that the art of his writing, it was a very difficult balance to kind of get across this sense of romance, lyricism, pathos, misery, the modern metropolis, which could be Berlin or Paris as well. And he talks at the end about, you know, those books in Paris where those guys writing books, and I might be him. Moses says, I might be like him one day. And he's thinking about, he says, Jean-Paul Sartre and all them other fellows.
That's right.
You know, so, you know, he kind of hints every now and then that he knows a bit more than he seems to know.
He knows,
but it's really a very, very cleverly worked book. And of course, he tried to write it originally in standard English, and he realized it didn't work.
It didn't work. It wrote itself, very fast paced, very fast moving. I also just wanted to connect to the points you made about that, you know, it is kind of very male, the orientation is kind of written very much from the migrant male's perspective. But is that because at that point, I mean, there were, of course, perhaps less, or it wasn't deliberate, there were less women coming because the men came first to the call. They were calling the men to work on the transport system, on the, you know, so the women were coming afterwards. So it was always the young males coming first, wasn't it? So
I think so. I mean, I think he certainly with Tanti and the Harrow Road and, you know, Beatrice and so on, he certainly brings in female characters, but they too are, I mean, Tanti's stereotyped as the West Indian woman, colonizing in reverse, you know, like that kind of Louise Bennett poem. But I think there's quite, again, a subtlety about the sexuality in the book, because of course the Black male, yes, is an innocent abroad. He's also seeking out white pussy, you know, that's one of the games as they go around Hyde Park. But also it's kicking back the whole time. It's right through the book, there's this doubleness going on all the time. So, you know, Moses alludes to, and actually explicitly alludes to, there's a wonderful passage towards the end of the book where it's just one sentence and there's about 7 pages. And it's like,
no stops.
Yeah, he talks about High Vale and Summer's coming to the city and they all fall in love with the city again. But actually on this beautiful summer's evening, there are all these pimps going around, and they're, you know, there's drugs, and they're trying to fetishize these young Black men. There's white women, white prostitutes trying to win them over. There's white women playing games with Black men, and
that's right.
You know, all of this, it's going on at a kind of mirroring. It's all, that's what I mean about it
Very
being
visual.
sort of almost like an underworld as well as both literally and metaphorically.
Very, very visual. I mean, you could literally stand there and see Sam Selvon's Brixton and Hyde Park and all those places where the characters walked. And yes, I think you're absolutely correct. So I think in a way, everybody's kind of using everybody. I mean, you're right about the white women fetishizing the men, but the men are also fetishizing the white women, absolutely. And, you know, having that idea that they can get what they want from these women that they may not be able to get from their own women. And also their own women are not here at that point in any great numbers. So yes.
And it's a kind of reverse violence of, you know, of the whole colonial experience.
Absolutely.
And this confrontation with their Blackness in the city.
Yes.
Which, you know, there's that wonderful scene where Sir Galahad sees a child who sort of looks in horror at him as a Black man, and then he goes back to his room and he stares at his hand and he says, "It's you that's the problem." He's staring at Blackness.
Yes.
Not me.
Yes, it's not, Yes. Yeah. That was, gosh, incredible. But all those, and I think so much of the book, you know, it is subtle. You know, I mean, it's there, but it's also so much of. There's so many subtleties. There's just I just love the observances. I really do, and I think a lot of the new writers writing on similar subjects have stood on the shoulders of Sam, and I'm sure they'd say so.
I think it's one of the great London novels, you know, alongside Dickens's Bleak House. You know,
Brilliant.
you can't
Brilliant.
see it any other way. Really.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also the fact that he, you know, he was such he must, the man himself must have been just so amazing. I mean, choosing to write the book in nation, what we now, as you right described, described as nation language at that time, you know, and obviously getting, you know, a massive readership was, you know, because, you know, even now, I mean, you know, when, you know, people like myself who've just written my debut novel, written it in partly in nation language, people ask, you know, why did you choose to write it in that sort of thing? But, you know, why absolutely not? You know, that is part of, you know, we have more than one languages in the Caribbean. You know, in Jamaica we have 3, and I'm sure that it's pretty much the same in Trinidad, you know, alongside standard English, which work perfectly well.
I think with that he felt it was really that if he wrote it in standard English but portrayed these working class characters, it would create a distance between the narrator and the characters. So he wanted to be part of the group.
Yes.
Or the speaker needs to be part of the group and part of that community. And so that was, I think, for him was the big breakthrough in writing it at the time.
Yes. Yeah. It certainly inspired an awful lot of novelists. He certainly inspired a lot of novelists since then. That's, yeah. Wow. Thank you for joining us today, Shayla. It's been a pleasure hearing about the books. Really give us an absolutely fabulous sense of Sam Selvon's writing, which I think will go on to inspire for generations to come. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be joined now by Margaret Busby. Margaret is a major cultural figure in Britain and around the world. Born in Ghana and educated in the UK, she graduated from Bedford College, London University, before becoming Britain's youngest and first Black woman publisher when she co-founded Allison & Busby in the late 1960s, publishing notable authors from across the world. Margaret is a writer, editor, broadcaster, and literary critic. She has judged the Booker Prize and served on the boards of organizations, including the Royal Literary Fund and the Africa Centre in London. She's a long-time campaigner for diversity in publishing and honoring fellow, and she's a long-time campaigner for diversity in publishing and honorary fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you, Yvonne. So good to see you.
Good to see you too. Margaret, you've had an incredible literary career, including publishing and working with many of the authors on the Big Jubilee list. Just to name a few, I'm sure you'll name many more. There's George Lamming, Jean Rhys, and Bessie Head. You also published an anthology around, I think, 26 years ago, Daughters of Africa. And 3 years ago, you published The New Daughters of Africa. And these 2 incredible books contain writing from women of African descent and from across the world. What do you look for in a book before publishing it?
Well, I have to say that although I did start off my career as a publisher, I'm no longer a formal publisher, although you mentioned that I've compiled anthologies, which is a sort of publishing. And I'm not looking for anything other than good writing, something that engages the imagination, and you can find that anywhere. So what I have always been concerned to do is to shine a light on writing, on literature that I think does exactly that, but hasn't necessarily been given the attention it deserves. So yes, there are writers on the Big Jubilee list whom I've published. There are writers whom I haven't published, but whom I knew, the writers who I read. There are writers who I I think are just incredible writers and have not always been given the attention they're getting now, for this list, if you like. Because in the 60s, which is when, no, in the 50s, which is when I first came to Britain, actually, and I was at school, there were very few, for example, writers from the Caribbean or Africa who were in the mainstream. So I didn't, certainly not in my formal education, have read a single Black writer. And most of the writers from the Caribbean who were being published, whether it was George Lamming or other writers like Andrew Solkey, they were being published in a sort of educational framework rather than for the general public or in sort of things you would hope to find in the high street bookshops. So we've seen massive changes since the 1950s to the present day. And I am just so privileged to have been connected with so many of the writers. I mean, you mentioned Jean Rhys. I didn't actually know her, but I abridged her Wide Sargasso Fee for Radio 4. So there are all sorts of connections, I feel, with the list.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Margaret. I'm thinking as you spoke that actually one of the first books that I really read and understood by a Black writer was published by you, and that was Buchi Emecheta. And I remember going out as a teenager, really, well, not quite a teenager, a young woman, just in my 20s, and buying everything that she's ever written. So she was the first Black writer and a Black woman writer that I had on my bookshelf, lots and lots of her books. So absolutely thank you for that. So my next question is, can you tell us about what it has been like working with these authors featured on the Big Jubilee Read list? And you've touched a little. Could you expand?
Well, there are many, as you said, there are writers whom I've had primary connections with. Like, for example, in the 1970s and 80s, I reprinted a lot of George Lamming's titles because they were out of print, as I did with other writers such as C.L.R. James. There are writers whom I published who could have been on the Jubilee list who aren't. I mean, you mentioned Buchi Emecheta, there's Andrew Solkey, there are many other writers who were really, Roy Heath was another writer I published for years. And to me, he's a brilliant writer, and I'm always glad that I published him. And but he, to me, hasn't had the acknowledgement he deserves. So I applaud all the writers on this. There are many I haven't read, but I think literature and enjoying literature is about spreading the net wide. And you mentioned that I judge prizes. Well, I love judging prizes, but it's actually quite difficult to settle on one winner, because I want to say, well, read all these books, read the long lists and the short lists, and just read and enjoy reading. So I think this is what I hope this book will, this list will achieve. Will let people see the wealth of writing that's been published over the past 7 decades, how many decades it is, going beyond the Jubilee list years, and just enjoy what there is to be enjoyed, whether or not it's literature that has been given the attention it deserves, or literature that may in the future be discovered. So yeah, I really am glad to see so many writers on this list, and there are many writers I have yet to read. So, and then many books I have yet to read. So I will look forward to reading those as well.
Wow. I imagine that what makes you such an excellent editor and publisher and all the things that you do around books is your massive capacity to read. I remember when you were judging the Booker, is that a couple of years ago? The one that Bernadine.
Yeah, it was 2020, yes.
Yes, I remember we talked, and I couldn't believe the amount of books you had piled up and were having to read through. I mean, that has to be incredible to read that many books and to be taking it in and it all in. I mean, I can.
Well, it's the same that for every year for the judges of a big prize like the Booker. But in fact, it was more difficult doing it under lockdown because we were reading on PDF on screen all the time.
Yes,
so that was,
you weren't meeting together.
Yeah, I don't like staring at the screen all the time.
And then, of course, all the readers, all the writers that you have brought to people's attention, and people like C.L.R. James, who actually used to live around the corner from me, and Thelma James, and Roy Heath, who I've never actually heard of, who lived again up the road, but
exactly.
a
He
councillor
was
friend
very
rang.
underrated, but he's just being republished. So
That's right.
I'm glad to know that. Yeah.
That's right. So a councillor friend rang me and said, "Oh, you must tell Margaret about this writer that I've just discovered." I said, "Guess what? I will speak to Margaret, but Margaret will know this writer, and she'll probably know a lot about this writer." So I contacted you, of course, and of course you had published Roy Heath,
yes,
and
I was Roy's editor, for years, and it was a joy.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. Can you tell us about a book on the Big Jubilee Read list that you have enjoyed, or that has been important to you? And
Yvonne,
many, I'm sure.
So
I know that's
many.
Mean, isn't it? One book.
No, but actually, you mentioned New Daughters of Africa, which thank you for being in it. And there are more than 200 women of African descent in it. But one of them, and there are, of the 200 plus who are included, there are a handful who are sadly no longer with us. And one of them is Andrea Levy. So it's good to see on the shortlist her novel, Small Island, because when I was putting together New Daughters of Africa, I of course wanted to include Andrea, and I spoke to her, we met for lunch, and she wasn't well enough to write anything new, but she selected a passage from Small Island to be included in the anthology. And actually, let me read you. I'll try and
Lovely. I was just going to ask you which one.
Yes. This is a passage, a short passage abridged from Small Island that Andrea chose herself, and she wanted to include it in. I'm thrilled that we included her in this anthology. And in fact, the sadness was the anthology was actually published in March 2019, on the same day as I went to Andrea's funeral. So
yes, I remember you speaking to me about that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Anyway, this is I'm not gonna try the Jamaican accent, so you know I can't.
Are you sure?
Do that. No, I won't. But I'll read you as best I can something from Small Island. Let me ask you to imagine this. Living far from you is a beloved relation whom you have never met. Yet this relation is so dear a kin she is known as mother. Your own mummy talks of mother all the time. Oh, mother is a beautiful woman, refined, mannerly, and cultured. Your daddy tells you, mother thinks of you as her children. Like the Lord above, she takes care of you from afar. Her photographs are cherished, pinned in your own family album to be admired over and over. Your finest, your best, everything you have that is worthy is sent to mother as gifts. And on her birthday, you sing, song, and party. Then one day you hear mother calling. She is troubled. She needs your help. Leave home, leave familiar, leave love. Travel seas with waves that swell about you as substantial as concrete buildings. Shiver, tire, hunger. But no sacrifice is too much to see you at mother's needy side. This surely is adventure. After all you have heard, can you imagine, can you believe, soon you will meet mother? The filthy tramp that eventually greets you is she. Can this be that fabled relation you heard so much of? This twisted, crooked, weary woman? This stinking, cantankerous hag? She offers you no comfort after your journey, no smile, no welcome. She looks down at you through yet she looks down at you through lordly eyes and says, who the bloody hell are you? You know I'm talking of England. You know I'm speaking of the mother country. But Britain was at war, you might want to tell me. Of course she will not be at her best. But for me, I had just one question. Let me ask the mother country, just this one simple question. How come England did not know me? Now see this, an English soldier, Tommy Atkins, skin as pale as soap, hair slicked with oil and shinier than his boots. See him sitting in a pub, sipping a glass of warming rum and rolling a cigarette from a tin. Ask him, Tommy, tell me now, where's Jamaica? And hear him reply, well, dunno, Africa, innit? And here is Lady Havelock, living in her big house with her ancestors' pictures crowding the walls. Ask her to tell you about the people of Jamaica. Does she see that small boy standing tall in the classroom where sunlight draws lines across the room, speaking of England, of canals, of Parliament, and the greatest laws ever passed? Or might she, with some authority, from a book she'd read, tell you of savages, jungles, and swinging through trees? It was inconceivable that we Jamaicans, we West Indians, we members of the British Empire would not fly to the mother country's defense when there was threat. But tell me, if Jamaica was in trouble, is there any major, any general, any sergeant who would have been able to find that dear island? Give me a map. Let me see if Tommy Atkins or Lady Havelock can point to Jamaica. Let us watch them turning the page around, screwing up their eyes to look, turning it over to see if perhaps the region was lost on the back before shrugging defeat. But give me that map, blindfold me, spin me round 3 times, and I, dizzy and dazed, would still place my finger squarely on the mother country.
Thank you. Beautifully sums it up. Doesn't really sums up the experience, of the absolute experience of so many people who came to the mother country and what they found. You know,
and Andrea captured it so well.
She captured it so beautifully, and you know, takes you all back to that question that everybody asked, every Black person I think who came at that time, and perhaps even still now, asked the question, you know, why did you come here? You know, why did you leave your sunny island, wherever that island, you know, happened to be? Because as Andrea said so beautifully, really, in reality, people had no idea where it was, but we definitely knew.
Well, your book again paints a wonderful picture of somebody going through that same experience. So I urge people to read The Day I Fell Off My Island.
Thank you for reading that passage. And something about she really was the first to give voice to this almost unbelievable story that the people were involved in it. They so described.
I wouldn't say that she was necessarily the first, but she did it from a perspective that was really unique. And I think we also have to remember that Andrea...
George Lamming, not George Lamming, Samuel Selvin, lots of...
Samuel Selvin, George Lamming too, and Andrew Salkey. There were others.
Yes, I think it was something about, maybe in her book, something about the women's voice.
I think it was that, and it was also the connection between the British history and history of those who came.
Indeed. And also that people weren't taught, you know, people, I think when I say first, I think what I really meant to say is in terms of actually the diasporans, the people talking to their experiences, but I think they were so traumatized that, you know, people weren't talking. I know somewhere in the book she talks about, not in the book, but she talks about in some of her interviews about really having to sort of really get information out of her mother, because her mother wasn't talking. And I think there are generations of people, including my mother, my mother's never spoken of her experiences in this country. So I think that's really what I was trying to say about how she brought out she was one of the people. I mean, Sam Selvin certainly, in the Lonely Londoners, talked a lot about, particularly the male perspective, of the men who came, and then since then there have been so many books, but that's lovely. Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to ask you, I think it's a final question if I can find it. Bear with me.
Hope it's not a tricky one.
That's a tricky one. Okay, so we again back on to Andrea Levy. We know that she struggled initially to get her work published because a lot of publishers saw it as being very niche. It was about race, they thought it would only appeal to Black readers. But of course, we know that she went on to win the Orange Prize for fiction, the Whitbread Book of the Year, and the Commonwealth Prize for Small Island. And it has been adapted for television and theatre. I've seen it myself twice in the theatre, and also watched it again during lockdown, because I think it was one of the plays you could see if you, contribute a few £10 or so. And I watch it again, and it never fails in its brilliance. So can you tell us a little about why you think Small Island has been so successful, considering where it was placed by many publishers' eyes?
It's really difficult to answer the question why Andrea wasn't always successful from her first books, because Small Island, I think, was her fourth novel. In fact, I first met Andrea at the beginning of her career, and we were both involved with something called the Saga Prize that Marsha Hunt set up. And I remember Andrea telling me she had difficulty finding an agent at that point. So I think what we are seeing is that there is a change in the publishing industry, as well as in perhaps the availability of books, because now all the books on the Big Jubilee lists are considered mainstream. Otherwise, presumably, they wouldn't be on the list. But certainly, as I said, back in the day, when I began publishing in the late 60s, I know I'm really old, yes, in the late 60s.
So it's a beautiful young thing, always says that. You look amazing, and of course,
well,
do not put you in that
thank
category.
you. Okay, enough of that.
Just have masses of experience.
No, but Andrea was a gifted writer, and I think she was also discovering herself as she progressed with her writing. So the publishing industry caught up with her, I think, in a way. I don't know how many millions of copies Small Island must have sold by now, but certainly it would have been inconceivable to the industry probably in the 70s or 80s or 90s that a Black writer could do that. And so, they probably would not have given the opportunity to a writer in the same way as they would when this book was published in 2004, I believe. So yeah, Andrea has been a trailblazer in that way as well. And Small Island is definitely a book that should give a lot of support. I mean, it's our history in a way. And remember the last time I saw you was at that launch of the book called The Frontline.
Frontline, yes.
And that is our history, discussing the what went on in the Grove in Notting Hill in those years, in the words of the people themselves. And in a way, it goes very well with Andrea's Small Island in terms of this is fiction that was dealing with the words of those who were themselves there. It was true life. So I think we need to reclaim these stories, and we need to hold on to books such as Small Island and just look at that history again and see how we are connected. It's not just we are in a corner as Black people or West Indians who've come here on the Windrush and we weren't around before that. We are
around since Roman times, And
our history is connected. We're not just
in this country.
People we can shove into October Black History Month and forget for the rest of the year. We are all part of a history.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We should have the opportunity to tell that history, whether in fiction or non-fiction.
And absolutely, Margaret. And we are massive readers, massive writers, massive readers. And we have always read. I mean, we read as a people, and we know we're not by any means homogenous, but we're a people who read very widely. I mean, we've read the classics, we've read Shakespeare, we read everything.
Exactly.
And when we go into a bookshop, we're looking for good books like anybody else.
Exactly.
So it is really good to see the publishing industries that were waking up. I think you've hit the nail on the head, Yvonne, because it's not that we only read books by Black writers, exactly,
or that only Black people read books by Black writers and white people only don't read them. So we are all looking for good literature, and whether we are from the same ethnicity as the writer is actually not necessarily the point.
Absolutely, absolutely. Oh, that is beautifully responded to. Margaret, I don't know, my final question to you, I know you've touched on it, but I'm sure there's more to say on it. How do you see, or how do you perceive the future of publishing in the UK and across the Commonwealth? What is working and what still needs to be changed?
I think we still have to address the fact that traditionally publishing has been quite monolithic in terms of the people involved in it. So there has been a feeling of, although Black writers and writers from other parts of the world, you know, writers of color, writers from different parts of the world are admitted, it's as if, what am I trying to say? I think we have to try and be on both sides of the divide. So it's never a case of them and us. So that you have Black writers thinking, what are they going to do for us? Because, you know, we can be publishers, we can be writers, they can, you know, everybody is part of the same venture, which is trying to make the world a richer place through literature. So we need to have people within the industry who know about things other than, you know, a narrow niche of things. You know, we don't want only I don't know, an Oxbridge view of the world.
Yes.
We want a view of the world that embraces us all. I didn't go to Oxbridge, did you?
No, definitely not. What was
Nothing
it?
wrong with it, but I mean,
Collingwood Comprehensive Peckham, or was it New Cross, somewhere down there?
Yeah, so I think we want to have an industry that embraces everyone in terms of not just ethnicity, in terms of class, in terms of every different kind of person there is needs to be part of the industry, the publishing industry, as well as the writing profession. So we can all benefit from those joint insights that can be there if given the chance.
Absolutely, and that recognition that we're Black people, and we write about whatever we feel to write about. White people who write do not just write about a white experience, our experiences. They've always written very widely about lots of things, including things that they may not know very much about. And somebody asked recently at one of the festivals I was at, or they said, you should write about this. And we all responded the same way. So actually there are no shoulds. We write, and we will write about what we feel to write about, what, grabs us, what inspires us. In that way, we're absolutely no different. But yes.
I think that's definitely true. And I think we also need to write and feel that we are in a position to be allowed into the industry. So it's not that the publishing industry is looking for a certain sort of writer or a certain sort of book. Yes. It can be anybody.
Well, on that note, Margaret, thank you for all your inspiration to writers of every ilk, every color. But I thank you especially for your inspiration to writers of color. You are amazing. You're my legend. You're my inspiration. Thank you, and thank you so much.
Yvonne. Thank you for letting me talk with you today. You brightened my day.
Oh, thank you so much, Margaret. And you enjoy the rest of the day.
Yeah.
I'm now joined by Damon Galgut, winner of the 2021 Booker Prize for his novel, The Promise. The Promise charts the crash and burn of a white South African family over 4 decades following the death of their matriarch, and the promise made to the Black woman who has worked for them her whole life. Welcome, Damon, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you.
Lovely. So, Damon, you've had a huge year as The Promise won the Booker Prize in 2021. Can you share with us how winning the prize has impacted your career and your writing so far?
Yeah, it's hard to speak about the impact on the writing itself because I'm still in the extended aftermath. of the Booker, which seems to go on at least a year. There's a great deal of noise attached to this prize. It's probably the noisiest literary prize in the world. And as the winner, you're expected to contribute your little share to the cacophony. So I've been talking a great deal about the book, about myself, about South Africa, far more talking than I'm used to. I'm a fairly low-key and quiet guy most of the time. So the prize is, welcome though it is, and wonderful though its effects certainly are, its personal impact has been quite overwhelming. So yeah, I've had to tailor my personality and my lifestyle to accommodate it to some degree. But behind all this is the knowledge that it's a temporary blessing, and it will recede in time, and my normal life will resume in some shape or form, but not just yet.
Indeed. So does that mean you've been rushed around the world, or rushing around the world, doing a lot of stuff on TV and radio and literary conferences?
I think COVID has probably spared me from a fair bit of travel. As you know, the world is only opening up, in the last little while. So a lot of it's been online. But yeah, a great deal of talking. And of course, now that people are moving again, I have done my share of traveling.
Okay, thank you. And can you tell us about your inspiration? I think we really want to hear about this, your inspiration for this book, The Promise.
Yeah, I guess for a lot of people, the expectation is that a book is inspired in a single moment, that, some image or some phrase or some anecdote might set off the complete idea for a book, which, to be sure, does probably happen. But for me, in a more general sense, books arrive gradually and piecemeal. So one fragment might lie around in your brain for a very long time before it builds up enough magnetic attraction to pull some other fragments to itself. And I think that was very much the case with this book. I didn't think, after writing my last one about E.M. Forster, that let me rather rephrase that. I wasn't sure that I had another book in me, and it didn't feel to me as if the engine was going to turn over again. But I guess, one has preoccupations, and my preoccupation as I get older is more and more with time and the passage of time, and a lot of my thoughts had sort of cohered around that subject. And I had a lunch with a friend one day who was telling me some anecdotes about the family funerals he'd been to, his own family funerals, as he's the last member of his family. And something about that afternoon, the notion of funerals being a place where families come together, after big jumps of time, it sort of occurred to me that would be an unusual and possibly interesting way to tell the story of a family. So that was the very, very first inspiration. But, a lot of other things feed into that. Obviously, I'm preoccupied with South Africa and its fate, the kind of dramatic changes we've been through over the last few decades. So that fed into it too. But, this issue, which gave my book its title, The Promise, is obviously a big political subject in South Africa, the land and who owns the land. But it came to me in the form of a personal anecdote from a different friend. I mean, my books are not, composed entirely of friends' anecdotes, but in this case, two of them did help. And this one was about, just the situation I describe, I guess, how his mother had, on her deathbed, asked the family to promise that they would give a piece of land with a broken down house on it to the Black lady who had looked after her, his mother, through her last illness. And it had been a source of pain and torment to my friend that his family had not followed through on that. So basically, I was already working on the book, at least in my mind, and that anecdote made itself clear to me as a thread that I could stitch through the tapestry. and you know, could carry through from beginning of the book to the end and give it a sort of coherence and a shape. So I would say those various elements were the things that generated the book. Whether they, you know, amount to inspiration is another idea, but you know, it's an open question whether there is such a thing as inspiration for a book, or whether slog puts these things in motion.
Yes, thank you. It's a magnificently written book, and I think it. When I was reading it, I felt, I don't know whether that, well, you've mentioned South Africa and the political situation over decades, and it felt like a metaphor for really the promise for really the whole, all of those events, the whole thing, how South Africa evolved and what evolved after, because it still feels to me, for example, so it's kind of both symbolic and real, as though promises made within South Africa as a country are still yet to be fulfilled. So I was really intrigued. The whole book felt to me like a metaphor for the South African political situation. I was also interested in, I was thinking about the deaths of the four of the people in the book, four of the main characters, and just wondering a little about that, because they all die in kind of pretty sort of abnormal and ghastly fashion, but also very normal. I mean, you know, it happens. That sort of thing really does happen, just like that. Can you tell me a little bit about them, and then their incredible funerals? I was, you know, intrigued. I mean, I think I'm from Jamaica and we love funerals. I mean, that's where so much happens. But I was really intrigued by these funerals.
Yeah, you know, once I decided that the structure of the book would be based around these four funerals, you know, that opens up other questions. The most pertinent, I guess, being how do these people die? Because if you don't die of old age, you know, I sat and thought about it for a while, and I thought I'd build it into the DNA of the book. And if you don't die of old age, you either die from an illness, which is how the matriarch of the family dies, right at the beginning, or you die through an accident, which is how the father in this book dies, although it's an unusual sort of accident, or somebody else kills you, or you kill yourself. I mean, those seem to me to be the available exits if you don't take, you know, the peaceful old age exit which life might bestow on you.
Yes.
But they're all of necessity violent. Any death that cuts you short of your allotted 70 is just by definition violent, I guess. So although that violence seems to have bothered some readers, it is, as you say, you know, not unusual or unnatural. You know, and then the other question that it opened up, which is actually more of a literary question, is do you then have all these funerals conducted under the umbrella of the same religion, or do you try to find ways to vary that umbrella? Which I did. I mean, most families, I guess, in the usual course of things, would tend to be gathered together under one religious roof, but not always. And my own family is fairly fractious in that regard. My mother has bounced us around between various religions. My father's Jewish and my mother converted to Judaism, and then when she divorced my father, took a more Christian line, and then she gave into her own more naturally New Age or Eastern tendencies, and we got exposed to that too. So I had a lot of fun sort of playing with the different religions and different religious beliefs, you know, that attend a ritual like a funeral. But at the same time, I was trying to make another more serious point, which is that, you know, people may think of white South Africa as a monolithic entity, but like most colonial societies, were made up of, you know, different creeds and lines that come from all over. And I wanted to reflect some of that, you know, fractiousness and the tumult of it, because it's authentic and true of the society I grew up in.
I love it, and I love the pace of the book. I love the way things just change on, you know, characters just can change on the page, and it's fascinating. I love it. When I grow up, Thank you for that, Damon. So my next question is, the Big Jubilee Read is about celebrating great reads from across the Commonwealth. What does it mean to you to be both the third South African winner of the Booker Prize and to be on the Big Jubilee Read list, the Big Jubilee Read list?
Yeah, it feels a little unreal to me that this prize came my way, to be honest, even though I've had a few months to get used to the idea. That I'm the third South African, and the third South African in an illustrious line feels even more unreal. But it's you know, not an honor I'm going to reject or pass over at all. Clearly, I feel the honor and the weight of it. You know, I assume that the Jubilee Read has been selected with at least one eye, partly on the notion of what being part of the Commonwealth has meant, really, to the various nations that have fallen under that particular mantle. So if you, I mean, I look at this list, and before the Jubilee list was drawn up, quite a few of those titles are familiar to me, and they've sort of brought me news of other countries that to some degree or other share, you know, the post-colonial history that we're all digesting and working through and reshaping, I guess. And of course, different nations are in different places where that history is concerned. I mean, South Africa, I think, is, thanks in large part to our own local history as well, is at a very, very complicated time of it in our post-colonial period. But there is a sense in which all of us have this common, whatever kind of title you want to give it, the common fate of being tied to, you know, the mothership of England and trying to untie ourselves and forge our own futures. And I think these various books, to whatever degree, reflect that struggle and that experience. And you know, insofar as literature is a place where people unite rather than divide, as opposed to the real world, that feels like a kind of a warm literary bath to be part of. I like the dialogue that these different books set up with each other, implicitly and explicitly, and it's very thrilling to be part of that conversation, I think.
Can you tell us, Damon, about a book from the Big Jubilee Read, following from that, that you enjoyed or by which you were inspired? I'm sure there are many, but is there one particular one?
Yeah, it's a good point you make, because there are a few. I mean, one could have picked various titles. In fact, I would reach for A House for Mr. Biswas by V.S. Naipaul. It's I mean, a book which just felt to me like a rich meal when I first encountered it, and when I've gone back to it over the years, has delivered the same sense of, you know, the same feeling of nutrition and reward. You know, it was the book in which I think Naipaul really found his voice. I think it was his fourth, if I'm not mistaken. And the earlier books had been preparations. I mean, he was still in the very early phase of his career and had not acquired the kind of razor sharp nastiness which some of the later books, I think, succumbed to. Yes. There was a much more generosity of spirit. He was still, I think, shedding his origins. You know, there's a great tenderness for his roots, and in writing about his father, in the figure of Mr. Biswas, as he's referred to all the way through the novel. I mean, Naipaul was famous as a stylist, a great stylist, and the music of the book is its deep pleasure, the kind of slow, measured unrolling of the sentences. But of course, you know, the vision of it, and to stress again, the tenderness of it, because that tenderness disappeared from his work later, I think.
Oh, certainly did.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's still there in force, and you can feel the there's a lot of tragedy in the book, but its comedy is also unmistakable. And a lot of the comedy is centered on the hapless figure of his father. I mean, the subject of the book is still a serious one. I mean, comedy, of course, can be very serious in its intentions. And the feeling about Mr. Biswas is that he's trying to stake out a little corner of the world that belongs to him. And more than just the house that the title refers to, it refers to a whole sense of identity. And his life is an endless struggle to create that in the face of external obstacles, some of them from his in-laws and the family that they're part of, but a lot of it is just life and what life throws at you. So we all relate to that, I think, in some way.
Yes, it is very much about finding an identity, isn't it, as you said? And it's not, what is home really? So it's not the symbolism, I suppose, is a house. Do you see any correlation between your own, the promise in terms of in the search for identity and Biswas, and Naipaul's book, The House of Mr. Biswas?
That's an interesting question, actually. I've not really thought about that, but yeah. I guess the thing about South Africa is that the notion of home and of having a place where you belong is under such contention that it doesn't offer the sort of symbolic resolution or harmony that the notion of home might offer somewhere else. So, the fact that this white family in my book occupies this, this house and this land, it's not a solace or a sanctuary for them, and it never will be, because their ownership is, open to question. It's not their land. How did they come by it? Being the deepest political question under that. There's no such political reason why Mr. Biswas should not own his own home or make his future. His travails, I guess, are far more economic. Can he afford it? What can he do? What can he make work? But there is the same sense of needing a little corner of the world that you can call yours in order for your identity to be complete. But that's probably a human urge we all share, however unfulfillable it might be.
Interesting book. I was talking to a young woman yesterday, a very young woman who on a tour around. She's a singer, and I was asking her what's her favorite book ever, and she's only in her 20s, and she's like, The House of Mr. Biswas. So it's still it's a pretty massive piece of literature and still resounding very much, even for very young people today. So yes.
Yeah. That's interesting to hear. And that's the thing about a great book, is that it's sort of, it's great. The greatness of a book really resides in how far it carries over time, I think. So the sense that a book can speak to you not just over physical distance, but over a span of years and years is part of what constitutes its legacy and its greatness. But I think A House for Mr. Biswas is going to speak to a lot of people for a lot more years still.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Oh, Damon, thank you so much. Thank you for that. Thank you for joining us today. Really enjoyed it, and very good luck. And let's hope, although you're enjoying this whole thing, let's hope you have a little let up before the summer ends, and you can go just enjoy the sun. It keeps on shining. Take care. Thanks
so much, Yvonne. Thank you for that conversation.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That's all we have time for, but thank you so much to all of our guests today for sharing their recommendations with us. I hope that all of you watching have been inspired to read some of the books mentioned and find out more about the Big Jubilee Read. You can see the full list of 70 books and find resources for reading groups at readinggroups.org. A book from each decade on the list is being featured on BBC Two's Between the Covers, which is available to catch up on iPlayer. And you can borrow or buy any of the books from your local bookshop or library. A big thank you to Arts Council England for making this event possible. And thank you to Professor Susheila Nasta, Margaret Busby, and Damon Galgut for joining me.